heard the name and you've seen the headlines. But here's something most people don't know. Ukraine is one of the oldest civilizations in Europe. And yet, for most of its history, someone else has been trying to erase it. It's the year 900. Vikings sailed down from Scandinavia, settled along the Dnipro, and merged with the local Slavic people already living there. What they built together became known as Kyivan Rus, one of the most powerful medieval states in Europe. And its capital, it's called Kyiv. By the year 1000, Kyivan Rus had its own written laws, its own church, even its own culture a few years later. Not only that, but Prince Yaroslav the Wise, whom I like to think of as Ukraine's King Solomon, expanded the empire, built the famous St. Sophia Cathedral, and made Kyiv one of the great cultural centres of the medieval world. But we've talked enough about great empires to know this. They don't last forever, because in 1240, the Mongol Golden Horde swept in from the east and destroyed practically everything. Yes, Kyiv was burned to the ground, and the whole state seemed to have collapsed overnight. And what followed was centuries of the same story, on repeat. Lithuania, Poland, Russia. Everyone carved off a piece of Ukraine for themselves. Sure, the people were there, the land was there, but the country kept disappearing off the map. So, while all of that occupation was happening, something else was coming from the horizon. It's a group of warrior farmers living on the frontier. They called themselves the Cossacks. And if you ask me, they were more than just fighters. They were free men. Radical, democratic, self-governing free men. That matters because at a time when most of Europe was still bowing to kings, they had their own parliament and elected their own leaders. Fun fact, they even helped the French capture Dunkirk. They also helped defend Vienna from the Ottomans. Oh, and they broke into Moscow twice. But that's not the most impressive thing. In 1648, they launched a full-scale war to become equal partners in the Polish-Lithuanian state. When that didn't work, they built their own. They called it the Cossack Hetmanate. It was Ukraine's first real independent state. But again, that didn't last. And in a moment of desperation, the Cossack leader made a grave mistake. It turned to Tsarist Russia for military alliance. Both parties signed the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav, which the Ukrainians read as a partnership. But to Moscow it was more of an absorption. So a decade later, thanks to the 1667 Treaty of Andrusovo, Ukraine was split in two, one half to Russia, the other half to Poland. And over the next century, Russia swallowed the rest. Which went as well as you expected. The Russian Empire banned the Ukrainian language from schools. It banned Ukrainian books, banned Ukrainian cultural events. The entire national identity was essentially being removed. Not with guns, no, but with policy, which was equally as effective, if not more. So what happened next? Well, most of Ukraine's intellectuals fled west to the city of Lviv, in the part of Ukraine controlled by Austria. It was a place where being Ukrainian wasn't a crime. Then came the 20th century. After World War I and the Russian Revolution, Ukraine briefly declared independence in 1918. By 1920, the Soviet Red Army had taken control, and Ukraine became a Soviet republic, trapped inside the same empire that had simply changed its name. In 1932, things took a turn for the worse. Joseph Stalin was in power, and the Soviet regime set impossible harvest quotas for Ukrainian farmers. When they couldn't meet them, the grain was taken away. Yes, all of it. People couldn't leave their villages, they couldn't keep food in their own homes. So much so that millions of Ukrainians starved to death in a single year. Again, this wasn't an accident. It wasn't even an act of war. It was simply, well, policy. And it had a name. Holodomor. It's a Ukrainian word that means death by starvation. Today, it is recognised as a genocide by dozens of countries and the European Parliament. Though sadly, that wasn't the end of it. Because World War II brought yet another wave of devastation. This time around, Ukraine was occupied by Nazi forces from 1941 to 1944. So you can imagine what happened there. Then in 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded in northern Ukraine, sending radioactive fallout across the entire continent. By this point, you think a country might just give up, right? But in 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine held a referendum on independence. Over 90% voted yes. Even in Crimea, the most Russian-speaking parts of the country, the majority voted for freedom. So after centuries of occupation, erasure, famine and war, Ukraine was, at last, on its own. But as we'll see in just a few minutes, this story isn't over. Ukraine sits in the heart of Eastern Europe. It measures about 603,000 square kilometres, or roughly 233,000 square miles, making it the second largest country on the continent, right after Russia. And almost all of it is flat. Just take a look at this. Most of Ukraine is covered by what's called the steppe. They're these vast open plains with some of the most fertile soil on Earth. And do you see that deep black soil? Well, that's called Chernobyl. It's so rich and so naturally packed with nutrients that Ukraine can produce enough wheat to feed hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Hence the name, the breadbasket of Europe. Now check this out. This is called the Dnipro River. It runs straight through the middle of the country like a spine, and it goes all the way from Belarus to the Black Sea, making it the longest river in the country. But besides its obvious beauty, this stream plays a more important role. It's a trading highway, a water source, if you will. And honestly, some might consider it the geographical heart of the country. But head west and everything changes. You'll see the Carpathian Mountains rise up along Ukraine's western border. It's a dramatic, forested area where you'll find a ton of winter sports resorts. And the thing is, most tourists have never heard of it. But I got you covered. If you scroll down, you'll find everything you need. From a travel-safe VPN to the best current flight and hotel deals, right in the description. But before you do that, let's continue our adventure, shall we? Because feast your eyes on this. This is the Black Sea. It's located in the south, and it's filled with warm waters, major ports, and has direct access to Mediterranean trade routes. See, Ukraine is more than a nice destination. It's a prize, and it explains everything we talked about earlier. Like why, for 1,000 years, powerful empires kept showing up at Ukraine's door uninvited. Yes, well, every prize has a price, which for Ukraine looks a little something like this. Ukraine's government budget for 2026 is around $112 billion. About 60% of that goes straight to the military to fund soldiers, weapons, defence. Yet they're still short $45 billion. So how do they fill that gap? Right now it's being bridged by international partners like the EU, which approved a €90 billion loan, or about $104 billion, and the IMF, which signed off on $8.1 billion more. But the numbers can only tell us so much, and if we don't look deep enough into it, there's bound to be something we're going to miss. In this case, we're only seeing Ukraine from the POV of the headlines, so we're not really grasping the fact that Ukraine's economy is still growing, despite the fact that 2026 is the third consecutive year under full-scale invasion. Farmers are still farming, and businesses are still operating. Sometimes by generator, sometimes in the dark. Okay, let me tell you a story. There's a 65-year-old pensioner named Tetiana still showing up to work because prices have risen and pensions haven't kept up. But it's not just her. Here's a 19-year-old named Makita who's still cooking in a restaurant kitchen between power cuts because life still goes on, despite inflation, despite the financial strain of the war. In fact, right now, the reconstruction bill to fix all the damages to housing, infrastructure, and energy is estimated at $588 billion. That's 2.5 times the size of Ukraine's entire economy. And yet, foreign investors are still coming. EU partners are still committing. That's not all. The president of Ukraine's Chamber of Commerce, which represents over 8,000 companies, is saying that more businesses are already asking, how do we invest after the war? Yes, people still believe there will be an after, and I have no doubt about that. Because as Ukraine's finance minister puts it, we are resilient and determined. And if history taught us anything, that's more than a slogan. That's a pattern that's more alive in their culture than anything else. Here's why. You know that song, Carol of the Bells? Yes, the one you hear every single Christmas of your life? That's Ukrainian. It was originally called Shkedrik, and it was written by composer Mykola Leontovich in 1916. The same man, by the way, who was later assassinated by a Soviet secret agent. The melody crossed the ocean, got new words, and became one of the most recognised Christmas songs on the planet. Nobody told us it was Ukrainian, right? But it was, and that's kind of the whole point. Ukraine has been quietly giving the world its art, its music, its culture, for centuries. Take the Hopak, for instance. It's an explosive folk dance full of leaps and kicks. We didn't know it before, but now it's being studied as a martial art. There's also the Pysanki. You're probably not familiar with the name, but you've probably come across it at least once in your life, because it refers to those intricately hand-painted Easter eggs. These are just two of the most beautiful aspects in Ukrainian culture, but there's more where those came from. Which begs the question, why do people who've been through so much keep creating, even when everything around them is being destroyed? Just walk through Kyiv today, and you'll find contemporary art galleries, opera houses, jazz clubs, street concerts, even restaurants serving borscht, which is Ukraine's national dish. You know the Cathedral of St. Sophia? It was built in the 11th century, and it's still standing today. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site which features some of the finest examples of Byzantine art in existence. And that's not all. The distinctive Cossack Baroque architectural style has spread across the continent in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's essentially a fusion of European grandeur and Ukrainian identity. Speaking of Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian artists at the time carried their influence all the way to the Russian Imperial Academy of Arts, shaping the St. Petersburg Classical School of Painting, while their own culture was being systemically suppressed back home. And then there's the literature. In the 19th century, when the Russian Empire was busy banning the Ukrainian language, a poet named Taras Shevchenko kept writing it anyway. He wrote about Ukrainian history, Russian oppression, and the soul of his people. Eventually, he became the most important literary figure in Ukrainian history. Not despite the suppression, but because of it. That's what occupation does when it fails. It creates martyrs. And martyrs create movements. Right now, it's happening on the streets. Because did you know that streets named after Russian writers for over a century are being renamed? Statues are even coming down. And in Odessa, the statue of Alexander Pushkin, the symbol of Imperial Russia's cultural conquest, has been covered up, not out of hatred, but out of reclamation. Yes. Now more than ever, Ukraine is taking all the necessary steps to reclaim their identity, their culture, their soul. And isn't that what this whole story has been about? So, comment down below. Which aspect of Ukraine's past and present struck you the most? As always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.